Alright, I know last time I promised more work on the 8.6 and I showed off all those parts, but I have something else that I really just need to get done by the end of the week, so we're doing that instead. But what could be more important than my 8.6? Allow me to show you. This is my gauge cluster, or at least this is my gauge cluster taken apart, but if you know what this looks like on the inside, you know there's something very different going on, which is this guy right here. Now what that is Gauge.S. Now, I don't really know how to describe Gauge.S. Basically, it's a very fancy Arduino with a screen that looks a lot like what the normal screens on BMW gauges look like from this era. Basically, what this can already do is tap into the car's K-line and grab important values from it. You can use it to display Vanos angle, fuel consumption, and a whole bunch of other things. Some of those things are already on this gauge cluster, so we don't need them, but other things will be really important, like coolant temperature. The other more important thing you can do with this is add more analog gauges to it. So if you wanted to add oil pressure and oil temperature but not have some ugly looking gauges in your cluster, you could do that. I found this because I was looking for some gauges that would actually look good in my interior. I didn't know where I would put gauges. I didn't want to do the whole A-pillar gauge pod thing. There were just a lot of possibilities that didn't look very aesthetically good, but this one looks great, and we'll see that in a second. For now, I've already done the bulk of the work of installing this. There's a lot of guides already by the creator of it, Sorek, so I will let you look at those if you want to know more about how to install this. But the basics are, for an E36, you solder on your 12 volt here, your K line here, and your ground here. The yellow wire you need to come out externally and run it to a button of some kind. You can tap into the BC button that you already have on your steering column if you have the 18 button computer. I only have the 11 button computer, so I had to just create my own button. I'll get all this together in a second and show you where all this goes. Since this does sit inside the gauge cluster and you need some wires to run externally, they recommend cutting out a little bit of your gauge cluster like this. That allows you to run your wires through to the outside through an empty bulb slot on the back of the cluster. And what this replaces is the mileage gauge. It normally looks like this, and we're getting rid of it for something that could display mileage and a whole bunch of other things. So you don't really lose any functionality, you just lose the looks of this. Now, when you're installing Gauge.S into your instrument cluster, there's a very narrow clearance between the tachometer motor and your LCD screen. The wire strip coming out of the LCD screen bumped right up against the edge of the motor, so to make room for it while you're installing it, you need to physically pull up and actually bend the tachometer motor outwards to make room for it. If you don't, you might end up with a broken screen and you'll be wondering why you don't see anything on your display. Similarly, when you close the two halves of your instrument cluster together, you need to make sure that that screen is pushed all the way up into its housing. If not, you're going to end up slamming the two sides together and cracking the bottom of the screen, then again breaking it. Also, for now, I'm going to leave all these wires bare. There's just a little bit of metal hanging out. Most of what's behind the instrument cluster is insulation, so there's no real metal for these to contact on, and this isn't the permanent solution. So this is kind of just a test fit to make sure that everything goes together well, and if this works, then we'll come back and fix everything up so it's a little bit more accessible in the future. As for my button, I don't know how well you can see behind the turn signal stock here. There's a blank panel here next to the dimmer scroll wheel for the instrument cluster, so I use that for my button location. And if we just plug that in, boom. Now for the rest of this monstrosity, there we go. It is a little hard to get out, so I'm not going to push it in all the way. Huh. That probably means the battery's dead. My anti-gravity battery has a restart function on it, but just in case, I put a battery jump starter on it. And it's there. Although for some reason my button is not working. Did something get damaged? Pinched or pulled? For the record, this button worked when it wasn't in the car, so I know something has to be going wrong here. So as soon as I started everything up, one issue became immediately clear. My button wasn't working. I had tested this button outside the car when I had everything out on my desk, so I was a little surprised at this. I fiddled with everything for a while before eventually taking it out to find out what the problem was. It turns out the wire coming out of the cluster for the button was actually supposed to be the power source and that I was supposed to ground it. I had thought it was the opposite, where it was already a ground and I just needed to provide power to the button. I took everything out and put the board back on my desk, powered by USB-C this time. I'd wondered why it wasn't working because the button still worked when it was powered by USB-C, but when it was in the car it didn't. The ground issue turned out to be the fault for that. However, when taking things apart multiple times and putting them back together, not taking care of that tachometer motor issue, I managed to damage my LCD screen. It was at this point that I had to wait for a new one to ship in, and I was kind of deadlocked on this project until then. Now, I ended up ordering a new screen directly from Sorek's site, which ended up taking a while, but if you want something really quick, there is this link to an Amazon part that is basically the exact same thing. The only thing it is missing is the red film. Also, this is how the individual screens are shipped from Sorek, and I'm a little surprised that he actually bends the ribbon back like this because I thought that's what damaged it in the first place. But if it works, it works. And I think the 3D printed packaging is also pretty cool. Anyways, with my instrument cluster apart, I soldered up the new ground wire for the button. I also took this time to wire in the necessary connectors for my other sensors. I bought these connectors off of Amazon so that I would be able to easily disconnect them in the future. I didn't do this for my button, but it's pretty easy to pop the button out of place and just pull it out with the cluster, so I don't think that'll ever be an issue. Also, during the time that I was waiting for the screen, I decided to wire up the sensors. I didn't know which hole in the firewall to use, so instead I made use of a hole that was already there by going through the fuse box, which has a big hole for wiring right next to the instrument cluster. The problem with this is that it required removing the 4 Torx screws that hold the fuse box together, and 2 of them stripped. But those ones that stripped were in the worst possible place to get to. So I spent over an hour just trying to get these screws off so that I could lift the cover off the fuse box and put some wires through the hole in the firewall that all the other wiring for the fuse box runs through. On the bright side, once I finally did get it, it was a very convenient spot to run wiring through. Now with my button wired up correctly and the new screen in place, I went to go test everything. Here goes nothing. Oh, it's not broken, thank God. Yes! I did not know what I was going to do if that didn't work. Alright, I know it's flashing a bunch on here, but I've got my button right here, which is out of sight for the most part. I can cycle through here, and I should be able to hold and go to settings, come up, go to here. Alright, I don't see the loader menu in here, so I think the car might need to be on. Gauge.S has been through multiple versions by now, but the way it works in the most recent version is that there is a loader you use to bring up individual files. There's a base config that runs all the main parameters, but then you bring up individual files through that loader that pertain to your car, your ECU, your sensors, and things like imperial units versus metric. I was confused here because I was looking for that loader menu, but it wasn't popping up at all. At this point, I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't have any more time. I had to pack up for a trip, so this got put on the back burner for a while. It's been a week. So the long story short is that I have everything working now, but there were a lot of hiccups along the way and it did not go smoothly. Let me tell you what happened. But before I go any further, let me give a quick shout out to a user on Discord named Elikos, who is on Sorek's Discord and happened to have the exact same sensors as me. He was not any more of a master of this than I was, and there were some parts I did better and some parts that he did better, and we both managed to work together to make it work. So thank you to him, because without him, I probably would have not got this far this quickly. Now the first thing I was wrong was that I didn't even have the right software version. That's why I didn't see the loader coming up, and I had to update that before I could even get the loader to show up. Once I did have the loader to show up, I didn't entirely know how to use it or what I was trying to load up. Now once I did have the loader working, there were a lot of errors with my code. And I didn't even know which files to select in the loader, so that didn't make things any easier. For a while, I was loading up OBD2 General, which you can do, but if you already have the base config file loaded, they are kind of duplicates of one another. OBD2 General just kind of has what config has plus a little bit more, and to be honest, I didn't really need most of what was in the general file. The main things that I needed for everything to work was just selecting the correct ECU, which in my case is an MS41.2 for a 98 BMW M3. And then, although I didn't need this, I also had my imperial.json file loaded up so that I could see all my units in imperial. All that imperial file does is actually take all the parameters that are already existing, add new parameters to kind of duplicate or clone them that are in the new units. So when you scroll through, you'll actually see all of the original units there in metric, and you'll see the imperial units as you scroll through as to which option you want to select. That was all I needed to do on the Gauge.S side of things, but on the physical car side of things, there were 2 more things that I needed to do. One was going to the OBD20 pin connector in the engine bay and bridging pins 20 and 17. I temporarily bridged the pins just with a piece of electrical wire that looks like this. That just helped me do some testing and make sure that I was doing things correctly. Then additionally, I found out that you have to make sure that you have your OBD2 plug closed. You see, on the US OBD2 E36 cars, you have your OBD port underneath the dash just like you would on most cars that you can plug a normal diagnostic scan tool into. But compared to some cars I've seen, that port actually has a cap that normally goes on and that's held on by 2 plastic straps. I talked to a few other people in Sorek's Discord that actually had a US spec E36 that they were trying to hook up things on and were having issues. In most cases, those plastic straps were broken and the plastic cap was no longer present. What most of us didn't realize is that that plastic cap actually has some pins on the inside that bridge certain pins. And the only pins that it's actually bridging are pins 7 and 16. So if you're trying to do this, you might need to bridge those two pins with a set of wire. But after I finally got this whole headache sorted out, I finally managed to get things to show up, at least for the OEM parameters in the Gauge.S. And this was a pretty big win. It was a long day and I was trying to work between multiple other projects and I didn't have the full time to commit to this. So having something finally work, even if it wasn't everything, was a pretty big step. And once I had my imperial.json loaded up on top of all this, I was able to see my coolant temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit in real time, which is exactly what I was after this entire time. Well, that was one of three things I was after. The three main things I wanted in this project was to be able to see my coolant temperature, my oil pressure, and my oil temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. Those last two got a bit tricky, but let me show you what I did exactly. The sensors themselves are some pretty simple VDO sensors, although I didn't pick the best sensors apparently. These ones don't have a lot of documentation for them in terms of their resistance curve. Luckily, the oil pressure sensor is a very simple linear sensor. For the temperature sensor, I was able to find an equivalent part number and find the resistor curve for that, and that's what I was able to use to program the correct equation to get what the temperature reading would be from that sensor. With the button and my sensors all wired up, it was time to see if everything worked. But long story short, it didn't. My programming for the actual sensors was not good and I was never able to get it working. And then I went on vacation for a few days and came back and tackled it again. During this time, that guy I mentioned before, Elikos on Discord, he basically figured out the code for it and got it working better. I realized I just had a few simple errors in my code and so did he, and we were able to sort those out pretty easily. But I still had one weird issue, which was that although I was able to see my coolant temperature and my oil temperature finally, I was not able to easily see my oil pressure. We tried a bunch of different things, seeing if the equations and polynomials we had hooked up were correct, but no matter what I tried, I really couldn't get any real readings out of the oil pressure sensor. So then I started checking everything. I checked the ground between the sensor and the housing, and the sensor and the entire car. I checked for continuity in the wire that I had run from the sensor all the way back to the instrument cluster. I even checked the resistance in that wire to make sure that there was nothing finicky going on. So then I checked the resistance that sensor was outputting while the car was running, and things got a bit funky from there. The resistor range was 10 ohms to 184 ohms, but when I got out my multimeter and started measuring how much resistance that sensor was actually outputting, it was all over the place. When there was no pressure at all, it was at 24 ohms. When the car was idling, it was at 220-ish ohms. Revving up a few thousand RPM was only about 230 ohms or 240 ohms. At one point I saw 400 ohms, but then it never hit that value again. I even checked the resistance of the output of the sensor and the body of the sensor, which is grounded to itself at least, and made sure there that even still, the resistance numbers were all weird and all over the place. I did use Fred sealant on the sensors, but the fact that the temperature sensor is working just fine tells me that that really shouldn't be an issue. And the fact that I can get very clear continuity between the sensor ground and everything else in the car also says that that should not be an issue. So my only assumption from here is that the sensor is bad. If it's grounded well and there's no resistance between the sensor and ground and everything else, I don't really know what else could be wrong except for the sensor itself. That said, I do have oil temperature and oil coolant working, which is already a good sign. I really did mostly just want to know my oil temperature more than anything. Oil pressure is good to know, but I already have the S54 oiling system on my S52, so I've never really had any oiling issues with the car ever since then. I also still have the dummy light in the car to tell me if I have any oil pressure or not, but we all know that that switch comes on at such a low pressure that it doesn't make much of a difference. I have heard some people say that they can upgrade the OEM sensor to read at a higher pressure, but the whole point of this was to have an accurate pressure reading all the time. So with everything working except for my pressure sensor itself, I put everything back together and hooked it all up. They put the cluster back together for what is hopefully the last time, and everything seems to be working accordingly. Before I went for a test drive, I wanted to make sure the numbers that I was seeing on the gauge actually looked realistic. So I sat in my driveway for a while and idled the car while I watched the temps come up. I didn't wait for oil temperature to get all the way up, but I saw coolant come up to a pretty reasonable number and figured that things were all good. Then I also remembered that I needed a better solution for bridging those pins on the 20-pin connector than just leaving a loose piece of wire in there. At first I flipped it upside down and just stuck it in the pins on the underside. It seemed to work pretty well. I tested it with a multimeter and it had good continuity. But as soon as I tried to put the boot back on, it fell off and it never seemed to stay in, so I figured this probably wasn't going to work. During that time though, I also put the cap back on and realized that I can't put the cap back on because it blocks the signals. So at first I decided to put some tape over the cap in the meantime since I wasn't able to use it. And immediately after this I figured why not just put some electrical tape over the same wire from before and make sure it's as flush as possible. The long-term solution to this is to buy another cap, take all the pins out, and hope that it will hold that wire down. Anyways, time for a test drive. For the test drive, there wasn't really anything that special to note here. I took the car out and warmed it up, and then I went up and down hill just to verify that everything was working as intended. I expected to see my values creep up on the uphill and then fall back down on the downhill, as I had an opportunity to lift off the throttle and let the car cool down for most of it. Both coolant and oil like to hover around 180 or 190 when you're just cruising down the freeway for a while, but you'll notice that oil temps always kind of lag behind coolant temperatures. Anyways, it was a warm day and the highest I saw the temperatures get to was around 210, but they cooled down from that pretty quickly. I wish I had installed these sensors before I did the hood vents so I could see if this actually made a difference in the cooling. Same goes for a lot of the other little cooling tricks I've done to this car. Overheating has always been an issue for me at hot track days, so I'd love to see if what I did actually made a significant difference or not. Alright, that's all I got for this video. I'm really glad I got this project done, partially just because I'm getting another project off my desk, but also just because now I can actually see what temperatures my car is running at when I'm out on track. I'm also glad that I have everything set up and installed on this now so that if I ever want to make changes in the future, like fixing that oil pressure sensor, I can do so a lot easier now. I got a few more videos planned with my white M3 at the track day next, and this guy, hopefully one last time before we sell it. And then as soon as I get through selling this guy, I will move on to the 8.6 because I have been dying to work on that and I have the harness just waiting to go in. So if you want to see that video when it comes out, subscribe and ring that bell for notifications, leave a like, comment while you're down there, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.